helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, Canadian certified counselor and award-winning psychotherapist.
Welcome to the Life Transformation Show. I'm your co-host, Denise Hart, and today we'll be exploring a powerful topic that could change how we understand ourselves and our family relationships. So we'll be identifying the 7 family snares, emotional traps that can hold us back from living our best lives. Some of these snares may even surprise you. Michael Hart, our expert psychotherapist, will be joining me and we'll explore how these hidden challenges show up in our lives, how they shape us, and most importantly, how we can break free from their grip. With a mix of counseling insights and biblical wisdom, we'll be sharing real, practical steps for healing and transformation. So stay tuned as we uncover these family snares and help you step into a future filled with freedom and growth. For those new to our show, you can contact us for counseling or comments at elimcounselingministry.com. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Denise. It's great to be here. This is such an important topic because many times the things that hold us back or cause us to struggle in life, especially in our relationships, are patterns that began in our families. These emotional traps, as we are calling them, can shape the way we see ourselves, how we interact with others, and even how we relate to God. But here's the good news. Psalm 91:3 tells us, He will save you from the fowler's snare. That means God can set us free from the things that try to trap and hold us down. But the reality is, many of us don't even realize that we are in a trap, as we will see as we go through this series on the 7 emotional snares. So today we are going to be identifying these family snares, and I'm sure that some of these are going to be very surprising to you. But before we do so, I want to take a moment to thank all our listeners for your incredible support and your interest in the show. Your engagement has truly made a difference. And because of the numerous downloads of our podcast, we are thrilled to announce that we have received an award from CHRI. We couldn't have done it without you. And we are so grateful to have you as part of our community and part of our listenership. We also want to extend our heartfelt thanks to CHRI radio station for recognizing the impact our show is having on listeners. Your acknowledgement means so much to us and reinforces our mission to provide meaningful content that resonate with our listeners. So thanks to our listeners and thanks to CHRI.
Exactly, Michael. Thank you, CHRI, and thank you, listeners. Well, today, a very interesting show. We'll be discussing this topic from Michael's book, which will be coming out on Amazon by November 1st. So congratulations, Michael, on your book.
Thank you, Denise. It's so good to finally have this project completed. It's been a long journey, but the book is finally out.
Yes. So, Michael, in your book, The Transformed Life, you talked about the 7 family snares that impact us from childhood into adulthood. Can you start by explaining what you mean by family snares?
That's a good place to start, Denise. Family snares are destructive patterns or experiences that children encounter during their formative years. These snares often arise from dysfunctional family dynamics, where the emotional and psychological needs of children are not adequately met. So instead of being nurtured and supported, children may find themselves trapped in cycles of negativity, fear, or conflict, leading to long-lasting emotional scars. So many of these children later on in life do not know how to resolve a conflict peacefully. They do not know how to love in a healthy way in relationship. They may become fearful of abandonment. They may react in ways that show that they are insecure and doesn't feel secure in their love relationship. So there are a number of ways that these snares affect us later on. And we're going to be looking in more details on these snares as we go through this podcast.
Powerful insight, Michael. So we can see the long-term effects these snares can have. Are there specific emotional responses that people might develop as a result of these snares that you see repeatedly in your practice?
Absolutely, Denise. The emotional responses tied to these snares can be deeply ingrained. For example, if someone has been abandoned, they may develop anxiety or fear of intimacy in relationships. So they often have subconscious fear that sabotages their connection with others. So those dealing with other snares will come across manifesting different types of issues. So as we go through the 7 snares, I'm going to be building on each of the outcome or negative outcome of each of these snares. So I won't get into that much here in this part of the show. But let me just point to what researchers say. Researchers support the notion that childhood experiences significantly shape adult behavior. For example, a study by researcher Dr. Adrian Sakulko on imposter syndrome highlight how experiences can create a perpetual sense of self-doubt and unworthiness. So people who have faced these snares often find themselves in a cycle of negative patterns, whether in their relationships, their careers, or even their spiritual lives. So until they consciously address and heal these wounds, these dysfunctional patterns will continue. So the research about imposter syndrome, what it's actually saying that when someone has a snare, even if they're highly qualified, they have their master's or their PhD, they will still go through life feeling as if they don't know anything and act as if they are stupid because maybe they were made to feel that way in their family life growing up.
So, Michael, Psalm 147:3, it reassures us that he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. So this emphasizes that healing is possible. So you discussed in your book the snare of domination. And this highlights how early abuse or overbearing control in childhood impacts individuals well into adulthood. So can you elaborate on this and how it shapes their self-esteem and decision-making?
So domination is the first of the 7 family snares we cover in the book. The snare of domination manifests in various forms. It could be sexual abuse, physical abuse, or psychological abuse, or, as you said, over-controlling parents. So these experiences deprive children of self-autonomy and self-confidence, leading to struggles in adulthood. They may have difficulty setting boundaries or asserting independence in relationship. For instance, children who grow up under domineering parents may feel their opinion and desires are not important. So this can lead to a pervasive sense of them feeling worthlessness, or it can make it hard for them to engage in relationships as equals. So they might either overcompensate by becoming excessively compliant or rebel against authority in unhealthy ways. So in my book, I use a number of examples to illustrate the different points. And let me say that these examples that I give in the book are not from any of my clientele or doesn't represent anyone in my clientele that I have seen. But in the book, there is a story of a young woman who faced sexual domination by her father. So his manipulation and abuse left deep emotional scars, leading her to submit to aggressive men throughout her adult life. Cheryl believed that love meant enduring pain and control from men. And so she went through life attracting the same abuser over and over again. It wasn't until she did therapy that she learned to establish boundaries and broke free from the snare of domination. And this led her to the ability to be able to enter into healthier relationships where she could express her needs and desires.
That's a powerful story, Michael. It's heartbreaking, though, to think about how many people might feel trapped in similar situations. So how can individuals who have experienced domination begin to reconstruct their self-image and reestablish their sense of autonomy?
That's such a great question, Denise. I think it begins with reconstructing one's self-image and recognizing that the patterns that allowed them to be controlled in childhood don't have to define their adult lives. In other words, that they can break free from those patterns. So it's crucial for these individuals to understand that their worth is inherent and not dependent on others' opinions or treatment of them. Because when you come out of experiences where you're dominated and controlled, you look for others to define your worth. You want others to tell you what you're valued. And a lot of times people who are dominated, they feel they have no worth because of the way that the domination has affected their low self-esteem. So it begins with realizing that as a human being, you have inherent worth. Despite of how you have been treated by your parents, you are valuable. You deserve to be loved. You deserve to be treated with respect. And therefore, you can begin to break those old patterns once you realize that you don't have to put up with bad treatment and that you can set boundaries with others.
Michael will be right back. You have been listening to the Life Transformation Show, where award-winning psychotherapist Michael Hart of Elim Counselling Services has been speaking on the topic, freedom from the 7 family snares, which he covered in his book, The Transformed Life. You can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com or by calling 1-877-204-2914 or 613-699-1677, where you can also make a donation to this Christ-centered ministry. Your donations help us to stay on the air and to provide subsidized counseling to those who can't afford it. Back to Michael.
So God has a plan to free you from those snares, from the snare of domination. In Jeremiah 29 verse 11, God reminds us, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future. So as we went through the book, we went into details of different techniques that you can use to find freedom from these snares. We don't have the time to go into these techniques in details, but one of the techniques we talk about in the book is to begin to identify how the snare has affected the core concept that you hold of yourself. A core concept is a deeply held value. For example, I am unlovable. I am not good enough. I am unworthy. I don't deserve love. And there's a whole list of them in the book. So once you have identified that core concept, what you now need is to begin to develop techniques to overcome those negative concepts that you hold of yourself. But we also talk about negative worldview, where a person may hold negative worldview such as others will betray me, or others will be violent, or others will abandon me. And so once you have identified your core concept and your negative worldview, there are many different CBT techniques that we cover that can help you to begin to break free from those negative core values and negative world value. So CBT strategies will help you to begin to challenge those negative beliefs and replace them with more positive, empowering thoughts. Additionally, it's important to establish supportive relationship, supporting yourself with people who encourage you to have a voice, encourage you to have self-autonomy, and encourage you just to be you. Many of us have spent our lives trying to be like others because we feel that we're not good enough. So if you have a support system where you're not being dominated, where you're not being controlled, it can be a very therapeutic setting. And so it's important to go through these CBT techniques and begin to challenge those negative core values and these negative world values that you hold of yourself and of others.
So, Michael, thank you so much for reminding us that God has a purpose for each person, one that includes freedom and wholeness. So let's go into the second family snare that you discussed in your book, neglect. Can you explain how both emotional and physical neglect in childhood can impact a person's self-worth, and also how it affects the ability to form relationships?
That's a good question. So let's look at exactly how this happens. So children who experience neglect, they often internalize harmful beliefs like I am unimportant or I am unlovable. So these beliefs that they hold of themselves distort their sense of self-worth and hinder their capacity to develop healthy relationships. So neglect can also skew a child's perspective of God, leading them to believe that God is distant, or that God is uncaring, or that God is uninterested in their lives. And that makes a lot of sense, because if your first authority figures in your life are your parents, and because of neglect, they behave as if they were disinterested in you, it's quite likely that you could start project that onto God and act as if God is disinterested in you. So we find that people who have this emotional snare of neglect often find it very hard to see God as a loving, caring God. But the psalmist, on the other hand, in Psalm 27 verse 10, says the opposite. He says, when my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. So what the psalmist is saying there, that you do not have to be victim to this snare of neglect, even though you may have been abandoned been neglected by your mother and your father, you can still hold a healthy concept of God. So neglect isn't solely about the absence of food or clothing. Neglect also involves where a child receives insufficient affection, attention, or validation from their caregivers, not being praised, not being applauded for achievement, being made to have this sense of of futility where you're seeking your parents' attention, but you never got it. Those are all forms of neglect. So often we make the mistake of thinking it's only about food and clothing. So a compelling biblical example of neglect could be King David. Even though we don't know everything about King David's childhood, we have some insights from scripture that shows that he may have been a neglected child. So despite being chosen by God to be king, David faced significant emotional neglect from his family. When the prophet Samuel came to anoint the next king of Israel, David's father, Jesse, didn't even bring him forward with his other sons. It's as if he was saying, I don't regard King David as being important enough to be at this meeting. So this is a form of neglect because David, a lot of time we read this story and we think that David was 5 years old or a little 7-year-old boy working with the sheep. But no, by that time, David would have been at least 17 years old. He is a big, strong lad. He's capable of fighting off bears and lions. But despite his achievements, his father didn't think he was worthy enough to attend a meeting where the prophet Samuel was going to anoint Israel's next king. And this story, if you want to read it more, it's found in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1 to 13. So this neglect likely contributed to King David's struggle with self-worth and feelings of unlovability that can be seen in the Psalms. So for example, in Psalm 69:20, David wrote, "Scorn has broken my heart and has left me helpless. I looked for sympathy, but there was none for comfort. I found none." So this verse illustrates that King David had emotional needs that were not met. Similarly, in Psalm 69 verse 8, we read David saying, "I am a stranger to my own family, and my own mother's children reject me." So these are powerful psalms that show that King David suffered emotional neglect. But notice something very interesting here in this passage. King David did not say his own father's children neglected him. He said his own mother's children rejected him. There are some scholars that believe that King David may not have been invited to the ceremony with Samuel because his father did not think he was his biological father. Now that's debatable and I don't want to get into that, but I'm just saying here, it's very interesting that he didn't say my own father's children, as was the custom of that time to speak from the lineage of the father. He said my own mother's children rejected me. So we have, that's an interesting tidbit, but the main point I'm making here is that these two passages from the Psalm show that there was emotional neglect in King David's life.
Great insight, Michael, about David's neglect. So emotional neglect can certainly leave a lasting imprint. So what does research say about the long-term effects of neglect on individuals as they grow older?
Research indicates that neglect can be as damaging as physical abuse. A lot of time we think, okay, as long as the child is not being hit physically or they're not being sexually abused, then that's okay. But research shows that neglected children often develop negative self-perceptions and withdraw socially, believing that they're unworthy of love and affection. So what is also interesting is that these studies show that neglected children tend to have more severe cognitive and academic problems compared to those who are physically abused. And this is interesting because a lot of times we would expect that it's the opposite, that it's children who are physically abused that are more affected. But the research is showing the opposite, that the cognitive and academic challenges are more severe with the children who are neglected. And also, adults who were neglected as children are more at risk for mental health issues, including conditions like antisocial personality disorder. And so again, this is interesting because a lot of times we tend to downplay when there isn't physical abuse in a family, but emotional neglect has serious consequences, as the research is showing. So one illustrative case is that we talk about is the case of Todd, who suffered from emotional neglect in childhood. So his sense of being unlovable created this insecurity that undermines his relationship with his wife. And despite her genuine care, he just could not trust and believe that she could truly love him. And this eventually formed a wedge between them that ultimately led to their breakup. So people who are neglected often find it very hard to relate in relationship to people who care for them, because they can't, their self-concept can't really grasp the fact that someone would want to love and place their interests first.
Thank you for sharing that story, Michael. It is really distressing to see how neglect can manifest in relationships. So what are some of the behavioral responses that people exhibit when they have experienced neglect?
So neglected victims may cope in various ways. Some may find themselves staying in unhealthy relationships where their needs aren't met, often because they believe they don't matter, whereas others may overcompensate by seeking material possessions to fill the emotional void left behind by the neglect, which can lead to financial troubles or conflict in relationship that is caused by the overspending of the person who is compensating. But the good news is that regardless of your situation, you can find freedom through the techniques that we cover in our book. And just a reminder that Psalm 91:3 tells us that surely God will set you free from the snare of the fowler. And so there is hope for your freedom.
Yes, Michael, it's encouraging to know that healing is possible even from the deepest wounds. So we're quickly out of time. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to today's show. And next week, we will continue with Freedom from the 7 Family Snares, Part 2, from Michael's book, The Transformed Life. If you missed any part of today's show or want to revisit it, you can find this and past episodes on Elim Counseling Services YouTube channel. You can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com. So please consider making a donation to help our Christ-centered ministry. Your contribution will directly help those seeking support and guidance. Until next time, this is your co-host, Denise Hart.
And Michael Hart, praying that God would bless you in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart.